Peace, family. It's your brother, Marc Lamont Hill. Welcome to Office Hours. Every week here, Sunday nights on the Marc Lamont Hill official YouTube channel, we hold Office Hours. That's an opportunity to have a deep dive, intellectual conversation with somebody with powerful ideas, controversial thoughts, or who is deeply engaged in a debate, a tradition, something that we need to unpack further. It's not a drive-by conversation. It's a deep dive unpacking of something that needs to be unpacked. And today is no exception. I am joined today by my friend, my brother, Sar Ahmadiel Ben Yehudah, who is a representative of the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem. Your official title is Minister of
Information.
Minister of Information.
National Spokesman.
National Spokesman. And, you know, over the last year or two, many people here in the United States and certainly around the world have heard about Hebrew Israelites. They've heard the word or the phrase Hebrew Israelites. Some of us have been using and talking and engaging the tradition of the Hebrew Israelites for decades.
Right.
But I'm not sure that people really know who the Hebrew Israelites are, what some of the fundamental thoughts are, what some of the fundamental ideas are, and also what the different strands and traditions are. And so I wanted to bring you on, Ahmadiel, because you represent one of the most vibrant, one of the most visible, one of the most successful communities of Hebrew Israelites in the world. I've also had the opportunity to hang out with y'all. I've spent time there. I've done some research there. I've shot some film stuff there. Got to sleep in the in one of your beautiful domiciles out there. It was just amazing. And so I wanted to just create space to build with you. And I want to say one more thing before we start, and that is that, you know, in the recent weeks, we've pretty much just had professors on. And I know some people are going to be like, well, how'd you go from professors to a representative of this community? And I'm going to tell you something. This is one of the most intellectually engaged, scholarly, committed communities and individuals, you in particular, in the world. So please don't misunderstand or ignore the long tradition of Black folk who have been autodidacts, who have studied themselves, or who have created their own learning communities and institutions to produce knowledge that mainstream spaces don't. So just all that to say, this week's no exception. We got a brilliant brother here who is going to break it all down. First of all, brother, how you doing?
Mark, I'm doing superb. Good to see you again. I've been following some of your various platforms on YouTube, and it's good that you're out there and that you're not beholden to the kind of pendulum that's swinging and that noose that's swinging above a lot of our brothers and sisters' heads when they tend to go into arenas that the larger media doesn't want them to enter. So we're doing good here. Good to see you.
I appreciate that. I appreciate you saying that. Because if we let mainstream media dictate our politics or our actions, we'll always be at the foot of our oppressors and our open enemies. I think the first question that I want to ask you is a question that people are going to ask me, and that they often ask me, which is who are the Hebrew Israelites? Well,
first, allow me to give all praises to the Holy One of Israel. To Yahweh. When you say hallelujah, which is thoroughly in the African religious tradition, that was the language we used. Hallelujah. It's actually Hebrew, and it means praise Yah, and Yah would be the name of the God of the Israelites. And so the Hebrew Israelites are both the ancestral identity and the natural progression, as I would see it, of those of us who were transported into the Western Hemisphere and who tried to hold on to their ancestral identity and did the best they could, first of all, without any texts, without any artifacts. After all, we left West Africa literally butt naked, but we did have with us an oral tradition, a cultural memory that in our songs in the Americas, on the plantations, we did not sing about West African landmarks. We did not sing about West African rivers. We sang about the Jordan, not the Niger or the Gambia and Volta or other rivers. We sang about Jericho, Jerusalem, and Canaan's land. And the thought was that we identified with the teachings of European missionaries. But if you're familiar with the Scottish explorer Mungo Park, when he went into West Africa in, I believe it was 1799, he encountered a brother there named Fantuma, who was a Mandinka in Sierra Leone, in that region. And Fantuma is teaching him about Joseph and his brethren, David, Solomon, Moses, and other characters in Hebraic folklore. And when he finds out this European knew those same stories, he's like, how do you know my culture? How do you know my history? And so our connection with the Bible, with the Hebraic text, predates Christian missionary beliefs. And so when you look at it from that perspective, when you look at the fact that in West Africa, you have the Igbo, from which were drawn a large substantive number of our people who then became the enslaved who disembarked in Charleston, for example. Well, I think the figures show that maybe 60% of who disembarked in Charleston were actually of Igbo ancestry. And the Igbo, didn't originate in West Africa. They'll tell you that they actually migrated into West Africa from Northeast Africa or the lands of Israel, where I'm currently am, and where we insist has to be looked at geologically and geographically in that context. And so the Hebrew Israelite movement evolved out of that. Many preachers that after Emancipation Proclamation, and interesting coming off of Juneteenth, but many of the preachers that began to move into the Midwest areas, they carried a message that taught that we were actually the descendants we don't like to use descendants now, but because of the fact that just the language, it infers you're going down, but they were actually the legitimate children of Israel. And so you had numerous groups coming out of the Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, New York even, where these were centers of Hebraic belief that we were not just any African people in the Americas, but we were actually African Hebrews, and from that particular ancestry. And so in 1966, our spiritual leader Ben Ami was part of a congregation in Chicago.
Let me pause you for a second, because you dropped a lot of important, powerful stuff, and we got time. See, that's the one thing about office hours. It's not like cable news where we gotta zoom by. I want to drill down on some of this stuff. You said some important stuff. So the first thing is the Hebrew Israelite movement writ large, and again, we're going to get into the specifics, of your movement under Ben Ami Ben Israel, coming out of Chicago. But the Hebrew Israelites in general, the organizing belief that binds all people who would identify as Hebrew Israelites, I would imagine, if I'm framing this correctly, is a belief that Black people of African descent, are what's the word? I'm trying not to use the word descendants now. People of African origin are genealogically connected to the children of Israel as described, the 12 tribes of Israel as described in the Hebrew Bible, as described in the Old Testament. Is that right? Yeah,
that would be accurate. Would be accurate. We're not saying that all people of African ancestry are Israelites, but we're saying that all of the Israelites in antiquity would be today called and identified as Africans. Absolutely. We don't even engage in a debate about that.
How do we know then? Because when we identify people, or when I see people proselytize in the street, or I see people share their information, or I hear people do their kind of hasbara through YouTube, and you all are very good at using audio, video, visual stuff, and Professor John Jackson at Penn has done some great research on how you all use these mediums. When you all are doing this work, it seems as if it's an open call to all Black people, right? in other words, the call isn't to check your genealogy to see if you're an Israelite. We're often told if you're Black in the United States or you're Black in Puerto Rico or Cuba or wherever, you are an Israelite, and to embrace that identity. So how do we parse out that distinction that you're making now, which I think an important one, which is saying everybody ain't an Israelite just because they Black, with this idea that we're not really, we're calling people kind of into the fold in a blanket way.
Yeah. Wow, Mark, that's interesting how you phrase that, and it really connects up. If I was to fast forward, it's very important knowing one's roots and identity. Obviously, I mean that's a mantra for us as in terms of who we are and who not knowing who we were, but wanting to know who am I. And so it was very, very important for us in the early movement that we were able to retrace our steps back through West Africa and back up into Northeast Africa and into this region and being dispersed at the hands of the Romans. So that is critical for us. And I think, again, that is something that all of the Hebrew Israelite congregations and movements that's our basis. However, that led us back to this land in the year 1969, 68 and 69 is when we actually returned, retracing those steps. And on arrival back here, it actually, the question the following day was, now what? And we had to go back into our cultural purpose and mission as Israelites, as Judeans, as Hebrews, which biblically, and I know you've got some fundamental understandings about these things, that we had to be, as Israelites, we had to be the light unto the nations, that it was through Abraham's seed, which is inclusive of not just Israel, but also Ishmael. It was through Abraham's seed that all the nations of the planet would be blessed. And so how do we interpret that? And so, yes, we throw a blanket call out, but we also have transcended in our idea that it's not the DNA, it's not the genes, it's not the bloodline that's so important, because what is it that would have made Abraham the first Hebrew? If we were looking at bloodlines, we'd be looking for Chaldean and Babylonian roots. So that's not so important. But what is it in our behavior? What is it in our lifestyle? What is it in how we carry ourselves and what we project to the world that would make us a blessing to the rest of the nation? So that's,
I'm imagining white people. I'm imagining a white person saying, "Well, if it's not about the genealogy, then why can't my Scandinavian behind, why can't my Ukrainian self, why can't my Spanish, personage be an Israelite too?"
But they could. They actually could. And there's biblical basis for this. The prophet Isaiah, in the 56th chapter of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah says a stranger can get a name and a place greater than of sons and daughters. But there's some criteria that goes with that. So it's not about, Mark, we're all Africans. If we understand the reality of that out of Africa model, which I know there's some tampering, they're trying to make some adjustments in that, but in essence, all humanity as we know humanity today evolved, and I don't mean in the Darwinian sense, but we migrated out, moved out, expanded into the rest of the world from Northeast Africa. That makes all of us Africans. Newsweek had a cover story back in, was it 1988, talking about this whole out of Africa model, and they had a black Adam and Eve on the cover.
Yes, controversial at the time too.
It was. It was the number 3, I think, seller of all time. That cover story, and you can talk to African Americans today, and I've never seen that.
Yep, that's how they want it.
So it is. The opportunity for what one might call salvation, the opportunity to be blessed, the opportunity to get this wisdom and this know-how that would save us from this European idea that has brought the entire globe to the brink of its own destruction. is open for all, except the first thing they got to do is unlearn that European idea and be willing to embrace a different idea and model. And that's what we say we represent here at Jerusalem.
When I started to study, seriously, Jewish history, and I started to sort of engage Jewish studies as a field and as a discipline, one of the things that I read in the kind of standard Jewish historiographies was that you can't really understand Jewish history or trace Jewish history without the Bible. That, there's a way that you can use, if I were tracing the history of African people, I wouldn't necessarily need a scriptural text, but, if I were to trace the history of other groups, there are a range of sources, but that Jewish historians do rely to some extent, not completely. There's archaeological evidence. I'm not suggesting that it's all based on the Bible, but there are certain dimensions of Jewish history that are rooted in scripture. We'll talk about the distinction between being an Israelite and a Jew in a moment, but as a Hebrew Israelite, is it safe to say that much of your understanding of your identity and your history is inescapable or undetachable from the Bible? Like, can you be a Hebrew Israelite without believing in the Bible as not just a source text, but as a kind of incontrovertible source text?
One of the things that rooted me in my personal journey, and I'm sure that everyone here and most Israelites, what they first identified with was the condition of our people that was incontrovertibly explained and described in scripture. Now, but then I got to put a pause on that. And yes, Jewishness is indeed, you would think, defined by scripture, but what scripture? Because we're not Jews in the religious sense. We're not adherents to the religion of Judaism. We are Judeans in our tribal affiliation and the fact that we live here in the southern Judean mountains.
You're in Israel.
However,
you're in Dimona. You're in southern
Israel.
Israel.
In Dimona, and this is southern Judea, which prior to, I would say,
but isn't that what makes a Jew a Jew? I mean, I get that there are rabbinical traditions. I get that there are cultural customs and things like that. But at the core, the idea of being a Jew is being of Judea.
Yes, historically. But what you have is now the identification with a collection of texts known as Talmud.
I see.
Which is not something we utilize at all. It's that rabbinical Judaism was a diversion from scripture. So most Jews have very little understanding of Torah and Tanakh, or the Torah. Tanakh actually includes Torah, but they're not rooted in prophecy. They're not rooted in those historical texts like that. But they are experts in rabbinical interpretations that have been handed down generation after generation. And so after the Babylonian captivity, this is where that diversion took place. And there's some great pieces that I would recommend. His name is Vysotsky. He's a rabbi. He wrote the book, The Rabbis and Aphrodite, or Aphrodite and the Rabbis. It's a great piece that gives a foundation as to what actually Judaism became. So we're not religious, we're spiritual. And it's not just semantics. There's actually, some things that would have to be teased out in that conversation. But our relationship with the Creator is 24/7, not just one day of the week, not just a study session during the middle of the week.
But you do follow tradition. I hear what you're saying, but I also don't want people, because I like how you said it's not just semantic. Because some people say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, meaning they want all the good stuff and don't want to make any sacrifice or have any discipline. You all are you observe the Sabbath.
Yes.
You acknowledge the Passover.
We do.
Right. You honor the New Year, not on January 1st, but
in the spring. As it's written in Torah.
Right.
And so, in fact, Mark, we actually recognize and interpret the book of Genesis, Bereshit in Hebrew, anything past the 3rd chapter of Genesis, humanity is in decline. And so therefore, we look to extract what we would call the original idea from those first 3 chapters. And let me give you an example. Everyone knows that Mosaic law, the laws of Moses, allow for the consumption of flesh. And even Moses said, you can eat this animal, don't eat that animal, don't touch that animal. You can eat this fowl, but don't eat this fowl. You can eat this kind of fish, but don't eat that kind of fish. But for us, when you go back to the very first instructions for diet given to man via the Torah, they're found in the first book, in the first chapter, in the 29th verse. I've given you every green herb bearing seed, and it shall be to you for your food. So for us, that makes it very plain that we're plant-based. We were designed and created to be plant-based.
Mm.
And so we went
you
back.
are a vegan community.
We are strictly vegan community. We're not vegan in the idea that we don't use leather belts or leather bags, or leather shoes when it gets cold and rainy and wet. We are vegans in every aspect of the dietary law, okay, which we prefer to call live it, even,
Right.
Live it, not diet.
Right. And that language is very important. And we'll talk about that too. And by the way, I have been to the kafar out there in southern Israel. I have spent time there, and I have eaten the vegan ice cream. Oh. And if you ain't had the vegan ice cream, which for them it's just ice cream. If you had the vegan ice cream at the Hebrew Israelites, African Hebrew Israelite of Jerusalem community, you ain't lived yet. I'm trying to tell you, it will change your live it. Talk to me about the Black, the tradition of Black Israelites / Black Jewry in America. There's a long tradition. I think some people think, and I've heard people say this to me, that the Black Israelites or Black Hebrew Israelites in the United States, which is the tradition out of which you all emerge, is something that's in the last decade or 2 decades or even the 80s. It's not. What are the roots of this tradition?
Well, the roots again go back to that collective memory, that collective consciousness that was present in, I would say, it going back as far, documented as far as Nat Turners Rebellion, where the objective of his military, of his escape and his military plans was a town in Virginia, in Southampton County. The name of that town was changed to Cortland. And many people that I know that live right there in Southampton County right now, when I share this story, they didn't know it. It wasn't taught to them. And then they realized, they said, oh, wow, that's why there's a Jerusalem street. That's why there's a Jericho street in Cortland. But the name of the town in 1831 at the time of Nat Turner's Rebellion was Jerusalem. And so a central tenet of Israelite belief is if I let Jerusalem, if I don't keep that foremost in my mind, let my right hand lose her cunning, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. And so Jerusalem was always a central object. That's where all the males 3 times in the year would go up to Jerusalem. That was central in our culture. And so I think that was one of the things that was carried over in our songs, in our recollections. And so that consciousness formed the foundation. And then again, those itinerant preachers moving around in the States in the turn of the century, 1900, Brother Fariyaye Jones at Howard University's religious school, he made a great research on this and said that these were not just Judaizing movements, but they 100% regarded themselves as of Israelite origin. And
So,
so
talk to me
that,
about that. Talk to me about those early moments, because I've heard people say that about Nat Turner before. I've also heard it about David Walker, or not David Walker, a lot of Aquino, and others, that they were identifying with a Jewish or Israelite tradition.
yeah.
How do we know that these weren't just Christians? I mean, the early slaves, the early enslaved Africans, the early slave masters were certainly imposing Christianity on enslaved Africans.
Yeah.
And Black Christians loved them some Exodus. Black Christians loved them Jericho and Jerusalem, and we talk about these stories. You know what I mean? You say, you know, that the Bible verse you quoted, which I believe is Psalm 137. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem,
By the rivers of Babylon.
By the rivers of Babylon. That's everybody from Black Christians to the Melodians in the 70s, right? Singing reggae. You know, so to what extent is that necessarily evidence that Black folk are Israelites, as opposed to Black folk were part of a Christian tradition that takes very seriously the Hebrew Bible and identifies very strongly with the children of Israel as part of the Exodus story and as part of our kind of, as you pointed out, self-identification and collective identification with the children of Israel, because we looked at our condition in the United States and said, yeah, that's us.
In the absence of such, again, textual and historical, you know, the enslaved peoples weren't allowed to, you know, to have that kind of intellectual, you know, freedom. And I think one of the greatest, you know, beyond anecdotal and conjectural ideas, one of the greatest pieces of evidence was the fear that led to the creation of the slave Bible, which deleted all of those references to a Moses, and the idea that freedom, the idea that an Exodus was something that was sanctioned by God. And so the creation of a slave Bible, which is right there in DC, you know, on exhibition there, that itself speaks to the great fear that the slave masters had of if we were to connect back with that tradition, you know, and what that might lead to. And so they left of course, the slaves be obedient to your servants. I mean, servants be obedient to your masters, etc.
Yeah.
Which when you really get into the idea of slaves and servants, I mean, many of us, when we go into contemporary African nations, it's not strange for people to have servants, you know, but of course, servitude and chattel slavery,
very different things.
Two different things. And so even the tendency on our part to want to be angry with the African that was historically involved in the slave trade, I would say certainly that they had no idea that what awaited us on the other side of the Atlantic was anything like what it was. I don't think they would have been involved in that, but nevertheless, it's part of the history. And so, and that I know is controversial in the sense that many of the Afrocentric scholars, they like to refute that and say that Africans weren't involved in the slave trade. But the problem for me, Mark, in that is that you give a whole lot of juice to a handful of scruffy Europeans coming into the interior of Africa to carry us away. I'm not prepared to concede that. You know, that doesn't make sense to me.
That's definitely a controversial debate, and that's one that we're going to have right here in Office Hours too. Just sort of the role of African people in the Atlantic slave trade is certainly an interesting one. There's a long tradition of Black leaders, Black religious leaders in the United States, who have talked about and sort of advanced the ideology, the belief, the movement of Black Jews and Black Israelites. And I'm still holding them together for a moment, although I think there's moments where there's divergence. I hold them together for a couple of reasons, but particularly at the beginning of the 20th century, when you had the Commandment Keepers, you had Rabbi
Wentworth Matthews, yeah,
that's right, who starts a Black Hebrew congregation, I believe in 1919, right? And when you have Frank Cherry, William Saunders Crowdy, when you have, all of these, Mordecai Herman, all the way, of course, later on you had Yahweh Ben Yahweh, you had Ben Ami Ben Israel, Arnold Ford. I'm just thinking, yeah, absolutely. And we could even add, to a degree, Dr. York, right, when he was identifying as
Nubian Islamic Hebrews.
Yeah. But he had a name. He went from Rabboni Yeshua. He had so many names. It took me a second. He went from Imam Isa to Rabboni Yeshua. And in that process, you saw an interesting sort of set of shifts, right? One was Black people and Black, like Rabbi Wentworth and others, who begin by saying, we are of this tradition. We are Black Hebrews. We are part of a lineage of Black Jewry, or of Jewry, global Jewry. And they attempted to enter the mainstream. There's a way that they wanted to be included and accepted by rabbis, traditional European rabbis, white rabbis, Ashkenazi and Sephardic rabbis in the United States, who said no.
And they rejected.
You're not Jewish, right? Talk to me about that tradition. What did it mean for them to want to enter that tradition, and why were they rejected?
Wow, I've actually done a bit of writing about that, and Howard Brotz's piece, Black Jews of Harlem, and how we've been marginalized by those anthropologists and historians and Jewish, I would say, gatekeepers, scholarly gatekeepers of that identity. It was fear. But our pursuit, and when I'm saying our, speaking of the Africans and the desire to even be accepted into that idea, that basically came from the religious identification, and again, teasing the distinction between religion and spirituality. We're on the other spectrum, and the other end of the spectrum, and the other end of the spectrum is the nationalist. And so I think that's how you.
What do you mean when you say that, nationalist? What do you mean by nationalist?
Well, you have an entire group of Israelite beliefs that much like Judaism, the idea of living in Israel is not important to them. Zionism became that movement for European Jews that was their nationalist, fundamental, return to the land idea. When you go back to Martin Delany was referring to us as Zionists. Garvey himself referred to us as Zionists, and Delaney's reference predates Theodore Herzl's by what? Decades. Decades. But Delaney's dream was just not just diverted, but it was actually derailed by the Civil War, and he was never able to get back to West Africa to bring our people back to the homeland. But that was the initial thrust of his Zionist idea. So
now Zionism is a complicated term for lots of people, lots of different things. Oftentimes in the current political discourse in particular, we're talking about political Zionism. We're talking about a very specific movement of Eastern European Jews, predominantly, of repatriation from Eastern Europe into historic Palestine, what is now known as modern day Israel, as well as modern day, Palestine. For some, Zionism is about the cultural piece of it. It's the Psalm 137. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, right? It's the, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land as you're imagining going elsewhere? For some, it's about the culture and the rituals and the tradition. And for some, it's about relocation. You're not just talking about Zionism in the sense of imagining yourself as part of a nation, or you're not talking about nationalism as just part of imagining yourself as part of a global nation, which is true. But you're also saying it's about building a nation, like a physical nation in a place. And for this tradition that you're a part of, the place ultimately is modern day Israel.
Yes, we regard this as our ancestral home. And so our return, was our leaving America in 1967 was actually framed in the context of a back to Africa movement, which in many ways it was that. It was certainly that. We couldn't deny that. We were going back to Africa. However, it was as much a back to God movement as anything else. It just so happened that our ancestral home is in Northeast Africa, which many people couldn't understand then and can't understand now, and it's okay. It's not a problem. When you spoke just a moment ago about historic Palestine,
Yeah.
one of the things that I would counter with is that Palestine was the name that the Romans applied to the land formerly known as Judea, and
Right.
and the Palestine Mandate was what Britain called its overseership of this region. And so there's lots of political skullduggery over the centuries and eons that this land has been subject to. But nevertheless, this is what we consider to be our ancestral home. And so in the context of the current, chaos and darkness that this region is engulfed in, we can't even have these kind of discussions because of all the nuances and the non-emotive kind of, things that you got to bring to the table.
Right.
You can't have a discussion if you don't even know what river and what sea is being discussed.
Exactly right. And a lot of this is feelings and vibes and not information.
So we just have to leave that on the back burner. But nevertheless, we're here and we have to survive, so all those things come into play. So it's complicated. And we have to tease through it. So we're nationalists because we are, we did embrace the idea of land, language, and culture. That was our mantra in the 60s and 70s, land, language, and culture. And so many Hebrew Israelites, particularly those manifestations of the organizations in recent decades, they're really fresh out of the Christian church and idea. And they've brought with them, as I would like to call it, the grave cloths of Christianity. Give me an example. The messianic idea is rooted in Hebraic thought. Mashiach was a term used for all the kings, all the prophets, all of the ancient wise men in Hebraic culture. They were all considered to be a Messiah or one who was anointed.
Right.
But the idea of a Christian Christ, the Christ figure, that is a completely different expectation. It has become singular, first of all, and they're looking for the return of this same singular individual. That's foreign to the Hebraic idea.
Right. That's Christian, but it's fundamental to Christian and Islamic ideology, right? Different ways, but Muslims believe that Isa and Maryam is coming back. Christians believe that Jesus is coming back. Just that he's also the son of God to Christians, and God's son of God. And so those are foreign to the Hebrew tradition,
right?
But sort of fundamental and foundational to these other monotheistic Western religions.
But the singular idea is foreign to the Hebrew tradition, but the idea of one who was anointed, and Solomon, David, Moses, all of, even Deborah, the female judge, they would all have been called anointed, and therefore Messiah or Mashiach, Mishikim actually in the plural, which is what was one of the reasons why the Dead Sea Scrolls were suppressed, because when they hit that particular passage in Isaiah, it wasn't Mashiach, the singular, it was Mishikim, the plural. And so the Vatican, being in possession of the scrolls, they suppressed that for more than 3 decades, that idea. And so amongst many of the Hebrew camps and congregations, you still have this Christian expectation of a Christ, or even call him a Messiah. They may have painted him black. They may have put him in some African garb as opposed and given him the African Hebraic name of Yeshua. But they're still expecting a manifestation of something that's rooted in Greco-Roman mythology and mythical belief.
That's fascinating. I want to go there for a minute, but I want to stay. I want to stay with the origin story of your community just for a second, because
Okay.
because you mentioned a few things that were interesting. Again, there's a tradition of Black Hebrew Israelites and Black Jews in the first half of the 20th century. We get to the 60s, as you said, land, language, culture. Those are three things that are emerging as dominant sort of ideas, goals, demands even of any liberation movement. But something else is emerging, and that is a man, Ben Ami Ben Israel. Went by other names before, but he identifies at the time by his spiritual maturity, I would argue, as Ben Ami Ben Israel.
Yeah.
He comes out of that tradition.
Yes.
He was talking to the other rabbis. He was talking to the other leaders.
Yes.
But he heard his own call.
Yeah.
And he formed his own community.
Yeah.
And as you said, the call to building a nation and to going home didn't take them to Northeast Africa initially. It took you to West Africa, took you to Liberia. Correct. And you were in Liberia for a couple of years. Talk to me about why Liberia was the choice. I've heard one argument that was kind of the prophecy, right? That you go there and it's kind of a sojourn in West Africa. I've seen the videos. I've heard the stories. I've talked to people who were in Liberia. It was not a pleasure. It wasn't a pleasure cruise. The tents, the weather, the lack of hospitality, and eventually you go from Liberia to Israel, what was then modern day Israel, soon after, right before the 6 Day War, I guess, right? After it wasn't 68. What year did you all get there?
We arrived in May of 68.
May of 68. That's right. You were in Liberia in 66, right? Forgive me. And so the cynical read is you went to Liberia, didn't work out, and then you made Israel plan B. It was a failure, and you went and you became plan B in Israel. I don't have a nickel in that quarter. I'm just curious to know sort of how you make sense of it and why you chose Liberia first. If you actually are part of a nationalist or even Zionist movement, why start in the West and not just go straight to Israel? Like the Eastern Europeans, they didn't stop, although they looked at Uganda and they looked at Rwanda, and these other places. I got questions about that too, but they ultimately went to a place. Why didn't y'all just go there?
Well, Ben Ami's vision in 66, when he received the vision from the Creator laying on his bed, and you're right, he was part of a congregation. He rose quickly through the ranks, and he would inquire of his elders and teachers, well, when do we go back to Israel? And the answer was not time, basically, for whatever reasons. And so disturbed, troubled by that, he receives this vision. And so all he was given in the vision was that he was to lead our people back to the promised land. So in the following year, in fact, he was told that he should do this in the following year. This was 66, so make 67, that would be the year of our Exodus. So when he begins to share this with other members of the congregation there in Chicago, they then say, well, the scriptures say that we should return the same way that we left. And then someone else comes and says, well, of course, West Africa. But where in West Africa? Someone says, well, there's Liberia that was created by and for former African slaves wanting to return. And indeed, two brothers were dispatched to Liberia. They went, they did the research, had meetings.
Why not Ghana? Why not Ghana or Sierra Leone or,
because Liberia was there as former African Americans, and in its constitution, it required that they keep their arms open to any that wanted to return. So for us, that was the place, and all this is tied up into the idea of a wilderness experience, that we could not leave America and the 400 years of captivity and immediately return back to the promised land as a people who hated themselves, that had no no divinity. I mean, we were broke down. We needed to unlearn that experience before we would return back into this land. There was a preparation period. It was a cleansing period for us. And so that's why it wasn't a direct move from the Americas into Israel. We wanted to go through that cleansing process. We felt like we had a maximum of 3.5 years. And all this was prophetically discerned, that 3.5 years would be the outer perimeter of time that we would have to make that transition. And so we were able to complete it within 2.5 years. And for those who made that journey, I know that they were quite pleased because, as you said, it was not a picnic. It was not a picnic by any means. So 2/3 of the original group ended up going back because of those hardships.
So Israel becomes the next stop. This is where it gets interesting to me as someone who studies the Middle East and studies Israel-Palestine and specifically this question of race. You arrive in Israel. You didn't make Aliyah, or did you all attempt to make Aliyah? That's the first question. And for those that are watching, again, Aliyah, or literally the kind of process of ascension, is the immigration process that Israel asks for or demands from people who are coming into the country. Effectively, beginning in 1950, Israel allowed for the right of return, right? The right of return law is a critical law in the state of Israel. It says that Jews anywhere in the world can emigrate. They can become olim into the country, right? If you are a Jew, you can enter the country and get citizenship. If you're a Palestinian, not so much. You could be a Palestinian living in Ramallah for 40 years. You can't get Israeli citizenship. But if I am a Brooklynite, a Jew from Brooklyn, or I'm a Jew from Ukraine or Poland, I can make immigration based on my identity and my lineage. And my lineage. Initially, it was based on halakha. It was based on Jewish law. Over time, the net of immigration seemed to be getting wider. Suddenly, you could have a grandparent. It could be on your father's side. They made the net wider to increase the demographic yield. In other words, to fortify a Jewish state and have a Jewish majority, they allowed more people in. You could read it cynically and say they was just the outnumbered Palestinians. You could read it generously and say it was also because Jews were under attack. Even if they weren't halakhically or legally Jewish, they were still under attack and assault due to forces of anti-Semitism. In other words, Hitler didn't care whether your mom or your dad was Jewish. The Crusades, the Inquisition rather, didn't care whether you had become a converso, whether you had converted or whether you hadn't, right? They were still treating you as a Jew and punishing you as a Jew. So there's a reason for having an expanded notion of Jewry. I happen to think both are true. I happen to think that there's legitimate reasons why you expand the net of Jewishness to let people in. And I think there's also a decision, a form of statecraft to expand the state to outnumber Palestinians. But in either case, y'all showed up at the door, this wide net. It's 1968 now. We after the 1967 war, to your point. There's more land, presumably more security from the Israeli mindset, because they've occupied the West Bank and the Golan and the Sinai and Gaza. And y'all show up in 1968. What was your reception like? First, did you make Aliyah? Did you attempt to make Aliyah? And if not, why? But also, how did they receive you?
For us, it was Aliyah. It was the return. It was the beginning of our ascension.
But did you make a legal? I'm asking just a technical question. Did you all actually attempt and register and try to make Aliyah legally through the Israeli government?
It wasn't so much that you register for Aliyah, but we were initially accepted under the law of return as it existed in that year.
Okay.
And we did it, no doubt we posed a huge challenge to how they were going to accommodate us. They hadn't encountered African people, and certainly not African people from America. And so here we were, and we were brash and bold and brazen, as we say, them
bright colors, them dashikis, them hairstyles, them braids. Right. Y'all did not look like the people coming from Poland.
Right. And so the initial reception was one of basic curiosity and accommodation, and it was non-threatening in that the first groups were very small, but the groups kept coming. And so what happened is that in fact, the earlier recipients of that reception, we did have access to healthcare, we did have access to schooling, we did get help and assistance in housing and all of the other things that were afforded to any others under the then law of return. But that was up until 1969 when we were coming in. First two people came in 1968. And that was, and I got to speak to that in a minute. If you can remind me, I've got to speak to that to show how we see all this as providential and not coincidental. But by 1969, the entire group of those who were in Liberia were now in Israel. And by 1970, the law of return was amended. And the amendment defined those who were eligible as you had to then have a Jewish grandmother, I believe it was. I mean, this whole thing is complicated. You know, to be a Jew, I think you have to have a Jewish mother, and be accepted under the law of return as a Jewish grandmother. But nevertheless, we were written out of that definition, and they made it retroactive.
What do you mean? When you say written out, what do you mean? Break that down for people that don't know.
That we could not show proof of having had a Jewish grandmother.
It was the grandmother part. Got you. That sounds an awful lot like the grandfather clause in the United States, where they say you could only vote if your grandfather voted.
Racism and those who practice racism can be very creative in their erection of these definitions that define people out of certain benefits and into certain identities. They can be extremely creative, and that continues to this very day, you know. Yeah. So that began, and you asked, you know, we were given then the opportunity. They said, well, you don't qualify, but you can convert. And for us, that was an insult. That would be that was a deal breaker. That was non-negotiable for us, because to accept it, we were not.
I get why it's an insult. You're saying we are this tradition.
Yeah.
We are the progenitors of this tradition.
Right.
We're older than y'all. It's very similar to the Ethiopians, the Beta Israel, who were asked to do conversions and symbolic circumcisions when their form of religious of Jewry, of Jewishness, temple worship is older than rabbinical Judaism.
Exactly.
Right? I get it. I get why you'd be insulted by the idea that they're saying, they're not only saying that you're not Jewish, but they're positioning themselves as the arbiters of Jewishness, right?
Yes.
I get that. But why not just do it and then be there?
I think two reasons, Mark. One was principle. In principle, that we did not want to look at ourselves in the mirror. We did not want our children to look at us. We did not want, and I think this was most important, in the eyes of God himself, we would not want to be seen as not having, stood for this identity, and to cave to the idea that we had to convert and change, therefore, to someone else's idea. Like you said, their defining of this identity. And the other, in doing so, that actually, it's set in motion a 25 plus year conflict with the state. And in the end, I think we've been vindicated in that we're still here, so we had to go through that. And that's how we look at it. We actually look at the experience as something that was necessary for us to go through. And let me refine that understanding. When Joseph was sold into captivity by his brethren, and later the brethren needed the help of their brother Joseph, who had ascended to the higher ranks in ancient Kemetan society, to where they were able to be helped during the famine. it is written in the scriptures that says that his brothers meant that for evil, but the Creator meant it for good. So let me clarify that. I'm saying that if we had been accepted and continue to be able to receive the hospitalization care, to be able to go into their school system, to get the work permits, to get all of those benefits, if we had been allowed all of that, we would not today be what we are in the arena of preventive health care. You know, we would not have developed the vegan diet. We would not have developed our all things in common sharing model of economics in social order in the community. We would not have taught children that we're not raising you to pursue a career. We're raising you and dedicating, not educating, we're dedicating you to the service of your people, of your community, and to the service of God and humanity. That's the mindset of our educational system. And so, had we been integrated into the larger idea, none of that would have evolved. And so we look now and say that was a blessing for us.
So that tension, that non-integration process, as you said, was decades. It's 2 of y'all, it's 10 of y'all, it's dozens of y'all. Israel's like, wait a minute, we got a problem. We got a problem.
Right.
You all were not legally permitted to become citizens. You weren't given permission to make aliyah. Y'all were coming the same way other people come. You were traveling on those tourist passes, those guest passes.
3 months.
3 months. You get 90 days. And then you all were overstaying your visits. You were saying, well, look, I'm going to just stay. They're not, and it's true. I mean, they don't necessarily go looking for you. Although being black with a dashiki makes it easier. I should say they don't go looking for most people. I know some people from Europe who have overstayed their passes. I know some people who've been there 10 years.
Yeah.
And they just bebopping through West Jerusalem like nothing.
No problem.
But y'all show up and they're like, who are you? They're looking for your passes. You don't have them or they've expired, but you still got to live. You still got to work. And you got to find a way to escape the scrutiny of the state, of police officers, of IDF soldiers. You all basically were undocumented immigrants, undocumented residents of Israel, right? You all, right?
Correct.
And as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that came with some, not just tension and anxiety from having to hide and move outside the law, but you also got exploited a lot under those conditions.
When brothers who did not have work permits, back in those days in the 70s and even into the early 80s, you only were paid once a month. That was it wasn't every other week and so forth. And so we worked jobs and we worked for people who knew we did not have legal status. And they would often take advantage of us. They would run off with our money and we had no legal recourse. Right. And so, but that played into the fact that even if a brother, say, was arrested on a work site and deported, which happened, we've had waves in our history where that did happen, where, a dozen here, a dozen there were actually arrested and deported. We would not allow his family to go without. So we developed an economic order in the community where we all put into the pot and took out according to what the needs were of the families. And that remains a central cornerstone of our social order. So again, that was a blessing for us. And honestly, great sacrifices were made because some of those brethren never got back. Never. Yeah.
Right. And I've heard those stories of, I'll be back tomorrow. And next thing you get a call 3 days there and they're in the airport in DC or New York. Yeah. And so when that happens, the state knows who y'all are and they know where y'all are. Y'all were pretty much all in Dimona. Y'all were all in the South. Why didn't they just come get all y'all and deport you? They could have done that, right?
They could have, Mark. But we like to think that we have a saying, they didn't bring us here, they can't put us out. And that's brash again, but that's our interpretation of who we are, and that there's a bigger there's a bigger force, there's a greater force that's running this show. And so I'm sure, and we know we have the history. We've seen it where we were regarded as worse than the PLO by members of Knesset,
Yes.
and deputy prime ministers who made these statements that we should be put on a barge, taken into the Mediterranean, and sunk. So we have that history, but there's always someone, and this is biblical. In the days of Yeshua in New Testament writings, there's always someone in the ranks of the councils who stand up and say, but maybe you need to leave them men alone, leave them brothers and sisters alone, because if they are who they say they are, you're not fighting them, you're fighting against God. And so that gives them pause. And we know that there have been modern manifestations of that kind of consciousness and voice in the Israeli society, who do in fact recognize the validity of our claims.
April 22nd, 1986, the big day, where the state in some ways absolutely did, as they say scripturally, test that spirit. They break down what happened on April 20th, because I think it's a pivotal moment in the history, and maybe a watershed moment in the history of the Hebrew Israelites in Jerusalem.
It was. We call that day the day of the show of strength. And what culminated in that was the arrest a month and a half prior of 47 of our members who were living up in the central part of the country. We were working as basically migrant workers in a orange packing plant. And for us, it was great because we got a lump sum of money. We got tons of oranges that kept us healthy through the winter months with the vitamin C. And so for us, it was, I mean, for some of the children, it was like a vacation to go and work at the orange packing plant in those days. And so we look up, and 47 of our members, ranging in ages from 65 down to 18, were arrested and threatened with deportation. We regarded that as that would break our back. That was something that we could not allow, and we began to strategize on how we could counter that. And we decided that we were going to march in mass from Dimona. We were going to all wear white. It was leading up to the Passover season. We were going to march in mass from Dimona to Jerusalem. And we
by the way, that's about 140 kilometers. That's like an hour and a half driving.
Uphill.
Right.
And one of the brothers recently, one of the other Israelite brothers recently was trying to tell me that Jerusalem was not mountainous. I was like, I don't know what he's talking about. You know what it takes.
A lot of time in Jerusalem is mountainous.
Any direction you're going up, and for extended periods of time. So we had our contingencies. We all had backpacks. Brothers had our staffs. We were serious about that as a protest, that we were going to Jerusalem to demand that our status be addressed, that these men and women be freed. And on the morning of that march, and we didn't ask for permission to protest, but on the morning of that march, the night before, Israeli Defense Forces, Israeli police from all around the region, they had people to be moved from their homes, adjoining the community here, the village here. They cordon off the city, roadblocks. We wake up and we're surrounded with tanks up on the hills here. Back then, where you stayed in the guest house, the nice domicile you mentioned earlier on, that whole neighborhood was not there. That was simply the edge of the city. And so there were tanks up there. The police had dogs. As you see, they got riot gear, batons. And we look up and they're shouting at us in the bullhorns and saying, go back to your homes. You're breaking the law of Israel. They were determined not to let us leave and begin that march. And so we that's the priesthood who led us. They lead us in prayer, and they were out front of the line of those who were going to leave that day. And when Ben-Ami came out, it's a testimony of the kind of the confusion in situations like that can often occur. That you can say one thing, and by the time it gets to the front of the line, it's something completely different.
Yes.
And so what he said was, stay in your places. By the time it got up to the front of the line, it was step out.
Right.
And so the brothers in the front wound up. They began to, and so it just testifies.
That's either miscommunication or agent.
Right. There was no fear. There was no fear by anyone in the community, even in the face of all that. And you've got to understand the context for this day, that this was a few years after Jonestown. And we had been labeled a Jonestown style cult.
They called y'all the vegan cult, the Jonestown cult, all of it.
Vegan polygamous cult, absolutely. And so with that context, we could see, and this is what Ben-Ami saw when he came out and saw what was going on. And he says it in the course of his message that day, which is part of the video that you're showing, where he actually says, we know what you came prepared to do, but we're not going to give you that opportunity. We came to this land in peace. We wanted to go to Jerusalem in peace. We wanted to keep the Passover. And so what kind of man, what kind of country, government would want to keep us from keeping the feast, keeping the Passover instructions? And so that became, he said, we're not going to let you, we're not going to buy or play into that. And we will stay. We will hold our places. So we went into a 5-day fast. And Ben-Ami said it that day. He said, you can't stay here. You're going to have to go back to your homes, And so that particular day, with all of the press that got word of what was going on, even though they tried to keep them away, they started to come and they began to interview us. And for the first time, Mark, you had journalists who were actually able to hear what we were talking about and who we were and what our narrative was. And they began to say, that makes sense. And that's nothing like what I've heard, And one particular journalist, a few years later, he came to us and he broke down crying. And he said, I wrote so many negative articles about you all. And he said, whatever it is I need to do to set this right, he said, I need to do it.
Wow.
But that was the reality that we faced back then. So that is the day of the show of strength. And from that moment, things began to turn.
Game changer. So that's where I want to go. And I know I'm mindful of time, and I'm mindful of the Sabbath, which is coming up sooner than later. So I'm gonna show this picture really fast.
Yeah.
Because this is a heck of a moment, from show of strength and vegan cults to you all standing hand in hand with the then Prime Minister. That's Shimon Peres?
That is Shimon Peres, yes.
That is Shimon Peres, Prime Minister of Israel, I believe on his 85th birthday.
His 85th birthday, correct.
Yeah. And that has been, for those who don't know, that has been Ahmadiel Ben Yehudah. We're in the red there, on our right to his left.
And that's the mayor of Dimona on the left.
And that's the mayor of Dimona, who I would not know. That is the mayor of Dimona. And Dimona, of course, for those who don't know, is a town in southern Israel in the Naqab, as we say in Arabic, or the Negev. It is very south. I've spent time there. I do my research in Jerusalem, but I would spend time there only to hang out with y'all. People are starting to understand the southern part a little differently now because of Gaza and because of Eilat and because of all the different areas. All that to say, Dimona is an interesting place, and I've seen the racial tensions. I've seen people talk about y'all, hear people talk about y'all. It's gotten a lot better, and this picture is evidence of it. But to go from a show of strength to that picture, a couple of things had to happen. I'm going to tell you what I think the three biggest contributors were, and you tell me if I'm wrong, or tell me where I'm wrong. I'm sure I'm wrong somewhere. Number one was the fact that you all stood fearlessly against the state, but didn't kill anybody.
Right.
Didn't fight anybody. So you got good public relations, which allowed people to reimagine your citizenship.
Yeah.
Or I won't use the word citizenship, your belonging there.
Yes. I like
Because
that.
citizenship is a legal term that we're gonna talk about right before we go.
Yeah.
Second thing is, you all did change your public narrative a bit. And when I read the writings of the 60s and 70s, I hear more of a critique of Israeli Jews and of European Jews. You weren't like the Hebrew Israelites in America that are yelling and screaming about, and I don't mean that to disrespect them. I just mean they literally yell and scream on corners. That's part of their proselytization. And they have a very different understanding of Europeans. They talk about Europeans differently. They talk about Africans differently, for that matter. So you all had a public narrative that was more welcoming as well. And then the third thing that I think was important is you all, or your children, joined the Israeli army. You joined the IDF. So you, and you can talk to me about what that means, or if I'm getting that chronology wrong. But it seemed to me that being willing to join the IDF showed a commitment to the state of Israel, both for probably personal reasons. We live here. We want to be, we see ourselves as needing defense, but also you had skin in the game. Again, that point, the public relations and the kind of shifting narratives. When I say shifting, I don't mean that you all changed your ideology. I just mean you took a different approach.
The emphasis.
The emphasis. Yes. I'm saying those are the three reasons. That would be what I would, if I were writing a book on y'all, which I'm not, but if I were, those would be three things that I would be thinking about in terms of how you all changed. Tell me what you think about that.
No, you're correct on all three counts, Mark. There's a little, the chronology is a little different, but it's all part of the continuum of the broader acceptance. But at that particular time, that in that picture, for example, by that time we did have status. However, it was in 1989, early 1990, Ben-Ami was approached by the then Minister of Interior, Aryeh Deri, who was a member of the Shas party, the ultra-Orthodox, but the Mizrahi side of the family, the North African, the Moroccan, the Yemenite, the Iraqi Jew family, the Tunisian, the Libyan Jews, the Egyptian Jews who were living in these areas. And so he literally said, look, I've grown up with you in this land, and I want us to normalize these relationships, these relationships between us. Yeah. And so that's what led to the agreement whereby we would be, first of all, and this is important, that we would first of all be re-documented as American citizens. And that's because back in the 70s and 80s, knowing that they were trying to deport us, we en masse renounced our US citizenship. And that prohibited them from being able to deport us because we were technically stateless at that point. So that, and that was a huge statement because everyone was trying, and still is trying, to get to America. And here we are snubbing our noses at America. And so that was the, like you said, there was a respect that we were given. We did not change the narrative. Our narrative has always been what it is, but the emphasis, unlike many of the brothers and sisters on the street, or not sisters, because they don't let their sisters on the streets, but the brothers in the Hebraic community that are pushing the narrative, we don't need to attack anyone else's narrative. We just put ours forward, and that's sufficient. We don't need to undermine anyone else's claim. I'm not an expert in their claim, how they claim connection to these lands. I'm not an expert in that. I'm an expert in how we claim ours. And so that alone, that was a little less offensive, a little less controversial. And so those things combined, and then once we did get the U.S. citizenship back, it led to the temporary residency, permanent residency, and ultimately it was to lead to citizenship within 7 years. That was the original plan. There's been a lot of hitches in that, and a lot of it is attributable to new pharaohs that knew not Joseph. But nevertheless,
Is Netanyahu that new pharaoh? Is Netanyahu, because he's been leader for much of the last decade and a half, and certainly, and even back in the 90s for a little bit, you know, is Netanyahu resistant to you all in a way that the other prime ministers weren't?
You know, it's strange, and it's kind of hard to ferret out sometimes because of the political situation. This coalition government. Netanyahu's hands are very much tied, and this really speaks to the current situation. Many people think that with Netanyahu out, that things are going to change somehow here in the state. That's not getting ready to happen. Netanyahu made his coalitions built, and a critical element of that was the religious parties. And the religious parties, over all of those years that he was prime minister, has been prime minister, they control the Ministry of Interior. And so therefore, anything that has to do with who is a Jew, who can return, who's legally allowed to be here, et cetera, citizenship status issues, residency, all of that is in the hands of the religious parties.
Right. And the rabbis control all of it. The rabbinate controls all of it.
And they are the ones who historically have been most at our necks, and who most wanted us to be out, which is what
they say. This is the land. They say it's a Jewish state, and y'all aren't Jews, and y'all say. But the thing is, y'all say we're not Jews. So that's where it gets tricky. But they've not let Messianic Jews in for the same reason. They say y'all aren't really Jews, right? Yeah. They've let some Christian groups in. So I mean, they seem to have wiggle room when they want to have wiggle room. Which I find interesting. There's an urgency though to that question I asked you, because some of y'all are getting deported. They've issued deportation orders in the last year or two. Where does that stand now? Are they still threatening to deport you?
We've been fighting this actually much longer, Mark, but it came to a head about 3 years ago, and they issued deportation letters to those that were here. But these are individuals who basically fell through the cracks of the original agreement back in 1990. That's the reality. And we were trying to get that sorted out over the years, and it was a can that the government, and in fairness, many of the families that are now under this gun, they didn't see the importance of it then. Right. But nevertheless, they ignored it. And much like we tend to do, we tend to just, be apathetic in those areas. But nevertheless, we rallied and said, no, we are not going to allow this, just like we did at the Day of Show of Strength, that we could not take that kind of hit. We're talking about 135 brothers and sisters who have intermarried and are very, very integral to the community. They're our family here. So we couldn't take that kind of hit. And we said, we're going to rally behind them. And as it's traditionally the case in any country, and particularly in the Americas, that when you have these movements, one of the main ways that they will break them is to issue arrest warrants, imprison, and then you have the long, dragged out court proceedings that are expensive.
But why do they want to do that to you? I mean, if you've proven yourselves, if you're a part of the military, I mean, y'all are and I'm critical of you all for this. If you all are as down with the IDF as anybody else, I've seen y'all make rap videos that Israeli children are listening to. I've seen y'all make food and y'all have influenced the military to take on veganism. You all have had people in beauty pageants. You all have had people be educational leaders. I guess what I'm saying is, you all are, if you're so well woven into society and they don't see you as a threat anymore, why not just let the other handful of families stay?
Because again, Mark, in that ultra religious sector of the society, of Israeli society, if you were to talk to the average Israeli on the streets, particularly those who coming from Western countries, from the US, et cetera, when you mention that the root of our problem is found with the Ministry of Interior, they go to rolling their eyeballs, like our sister Brianna. you know, and right. And so they are familiar with the obstacles and the opposition that comes from that segment of the society. And Netanyahu or any other politician could have long ago resolved our problems. There are two people who could sign off on this problem and it'd be finished. And those two people are the prime minister and the minister of interior. But if they did that, they immediately would face the backlash from those political parties, from those religious political parties. And so they're hesitant. They don't want to do that. And so they continue to kick the can down or up the road. But to bring you up to speed, though, we've had numerous court hearings. We've been back and forth in the ranks of the Ministry of Interior. We've been through the earlier judicial system. And as you know, Israel, leading up to October 7th, was on the brink of civil war around this whole idea of judicial reform.
Yeah.
And so that put a pause in that. But the courts were basically kind of back and forth, ruling for and against. And we ended up having, I think, about 14 families who were given permanent or temporary residency with the same plan to go forward. And then we had others who were given the opportunity to apply for humanitarian on the humanitarian track. And so we're rolling along with it. We're still fighting it, but life goes on for us. Everything is on pause relative to anyone being deported. However, that is a matter of record that they cannot deport us right now.
Okay. The question people who are watching this are going to ask, particularly my audience, is what makes y'all different than every other settler that comes here, right? If you come here, you move here, you're taking in land that Palestinians can't live on. You're part of the Israeli military, which right now is waging a genocide in Gaza. And many people, in fact, you're not even many, all of you all are kind of animated by a faith claim that this is your land, right? That's founded in scripture. What are you just more settler? Why aren't you more just settler colonizers?
Well, I mean, first of all, we thoroughly 100% contend that this is our ancestral homeland. And so that answer is quite simple, you know, that this is our home. And the second part of that is that we have to survive. Now, the reality is that the state of Israel is, you know, you mentioned earlier about the 67 6-day war. We actually feel that this was all providential, in that had we arrived in this land and the land had been under those who were the gatekeepers had been Palestinian Arabs, that we would have had a much more difficult time than had we come through the Jewish family, because there's a lot of affinity there. There are connections, there's a closeness, there are parallels that do not exist with the Palestinian side of the family.
I got to push back though, because Palestinians have always been welcoming. They were even welcoming to Jews. What they resisted was colonization. They resisted people taking their land. They resisted the processes by which the global European power structure enabled a settler colonial project. But to just come and find refuge, I think actually Palestinians would have been, as they have historically, been quite welcoming to the stranger.
I'm not going to disagree on that, but by 1967 and 68, 69, by the time we were coming, some other things were in motion.
You say after the 6-day war, there was such tension that a group of people identifying as Israelites would have had a problem entering into. Gotcha. Okay, that's fair.
Okay, and our track record speaks to the fact that we understand what you're speaking of, because just up the road with the Afro-Bedouin community and the surrounding, I mean, Israel is such a patchwork, and you know this. 50% of the people here are of Arab ancestry, and even 50% of the Jewish population here is basically Arab ancestry. And what's so strange about it is that when you look at those who who are so anti-Arab and lead the anti-Arab marches, death to Arabs and down, they are actually of Arab ancestry themselves. They are the Moroccan Jews. They are the Libyan. They are the Yemenites. They are the
they're the demographic majority of Israel. The majority of Jews at this point in Mizrahi.
The Mizrahim, right? So
yeah.
All of this has to be. All of this speaks to, as I would say, Mark, that everyone here, not everyone, but the vast majority of people here are all victims of this religious deception. And so someone, because we do believe in the prophetic mandate that Israel was to play in these times, in these latter days.
Let me just push you on that. When you say Israel, prophetically, they're talking about the kingdom of Israel, not the state of Israel, not the government of Israel, not the settler colonial apartheid state.
There's two Israels, and that all has to be teased out. Absolutely, you're correct. You're absolutely correct. And so, you know, we actually, Mark, we actually have a greater Israel that's bigger than from the river to the sea. When you look at the promised land, it was from the Nile to the Euphrates. So ultimately, in our larger vision for what is to unfold here in this region, that all of these colonial boundaries that were imposed by the French and the British when they divided all this up back before World War I even ended, that all of that is going to have to melt away. Now, how that unfolds, I don't have a magic wand or magic crystal ball that shows.
That would be my question. That I was going to ask you about the how.
Right. Well, I mean, but the reality is that we actually see certain prophetic unfoldings taking place that 30 years ago we would have said, "Wow, we couldn't see that." You know,
I want to show this picture, by the way, for the audience. You mentioned Beersheba, and you mentioned the Afro-Bedouin community. What's interesting here, so on the left is you looking somehow, you look younger every time I see you. That's you. That's me at the bottom of the screen. To my right, with his arm around me, on the left on the screen is one of the brothers from the Kafar. And then above us are some Afro-Bedouin brothers.
Sheikh Aid next to me.
Yep.
Sheikh Aid is one of the leaders of the Afro-Bedouin community in Segev Shalom, which is just outside of Beersheba. And he's he's a spokesman for the African presence here. You know, and this mark is the key. There's a third narrative to this land that, you know, we're all familiar with the Jewish and the Palestinian contentions of competing narratives. But the third narrative is an African narrative, which actually embodies both of those sides. And so we feel that it is the African narrative that has the capacity to enter into this fray and bring with us our innate spiritual understanding and our innate understanding of what makes for peace. And that it is our presence here and our understanding that can bring to fruition the promises of the scriptures, the promises that this would be a land of peace, and from here would be a light to the rest of the nations. But right now, you know, with the way things are going, it's absurd. There's no way that.
How do you? And this is my last question on this, and I got one final question. This is my last question on this.
All right.
If you took the moral high ground and said, we can't do symbolic conversions, we can't do any of this stuff because we want to stand 10 toes down on the idea that we are who we say we are. If you didn't accept the legal mandate of Aliyah because you said we have a principled reason to be here, we're going to have a show of strength and defy the law, civil disobedience, right? I agree with all of it as the principle of civil disobedience. Then how do you justify joining the IDF if that very same nation that is not an eligible nation, that is not the kingdom of God, which is not produced by the real people who are the real stewards of this land, if that's all the narrative, then if you can't do any of the other stuff with the state, why join a military which has a documented record of doing so much harm to so many innocent and vulnerable people?
that is the other element, and that basically for us, Mark, was survival. Even when we didn't have status, when we weren't able to to defend ourselves, we would want to have when Saddam Hussein started shooting Scud missiles at Dimona. If it's just innately that we have to survive. We will have to tread the dangerous and this minefield until then. And it's interesting. I just recently wrote a chapter for a book about October 7th. I'm one of many people that the editor solicited to contribute. And I actually tell the story of my son, my last born, who is currently in the IDF, but
I know him. He's a basketball player, right?
No, this one actually, no. I had another one. I had.
Oh, that's right. I'm old, man. Time be moving. Yeah. Forgive me. I forgot. Right.
But he actually was the first to go through in his mind possibly being a conscientious objector. And I actually, in counseling with him and in making sure that he understood that there were consequences regarding whatever the decision would be, I was good with it. Once I understood that he understood the consequences. And so he came close to actually being our first conscientious objector. But what I say in the chapter I wrote is that this is kind of like, for me, it may be the harbinger of our coming of age relative to this idea that the state of Israel may not be able to 100% count on us as being, ready to. I mean, we've had a 100% induction rate since we got that status. It doesn't mean that we would not do national service, but it just speaks to the fact that, wait a minute, there's some problems here. And so we as residents, we as citizens, we as members of this society, there's some things that we would have to say, hey, we disagree with that. We're going in the wrong direction. And Mark, globally, because when you zoom out from that little strip of land called Gaza, when you zoom out further from this little strip of land called Israel, quickly Ethiopia, Sudan, DRC, Ukraine, all of these places that are ravaged by genocide. Let's call it what it is. These are all genocides. The fact that in America, that the Black rate of maternal mortality is going up, that infant mortality is rising, that your life expectancy in America is going down. That plastics are found in your sperm, that your sperm count is going down. This is a global genocide taking place. And so I don't want us to get lost in this idea. And obviously, because when Congress passed the $95 billion arms appropriation bill, weapons going to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, how is it that the next day that Biden can call that a great day for world peace? And right. Nobody says, wait a minute, something's wrong with that. Something's wrong with that. And so we're at a point, and I don't know, I want to go to the words of Yeshua, where in his Mount Olivet discourse, when he talked about that presence that would come back, that spiritual, what will be the sign of thy coming? But actually, it's presence in the true translation. Yeah. And he says wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and pestilence, etc. But then he goes on and he says that except that those or these days be shortened, in other words, except that dominion that brought the world to that point, except that dominion be shortened, he says, no flesh shall be saved. That sounds like a genocide. He foretold of a genocide, a global genocide. So we're witnesses to that. But it's from this land that somewhere this voice of reason, these peacemakers are supposed to come forward. And that's why I'm saying that it is the African It is the African concept. It is the African idea. It is the African interpretation of these prophecies. It is the African interpretation of what it means to be a light unto the nations, not Netanyahu's idea of military prowess, technology, finances. No, it has to be something moral. It has to be something that is in connection and in harmony with the creation. That is what we're supposed to bring. And if Hebrew was is an African language, I think it's going to take Africans to correctly interpret some of these concepts, because the idea of chosenness from the Eurocentric idea has elevated them in a typical Eurocentric fashion, that we're superior, we're better than other people. And that's contrary to the spirituality. What was chosen and what is elevated was our responsibility and obligation to the rest of the human family to be that source of light and direction. So we have to survive here, Mark. And if it meant we being part of the IDF, actually that played into our favor, because as you said, we were able to influence a whole generation of IDF who looked at our sons and daughters and said, why don't you eat meat? And now Israel is probably the most vegan of all countries on the planet. We take some credit for that. So there's some other things. There's some other teachings. There's some other ideas and elements.
When you come back, we're gonna have more of these conversations. I'm gonna push you on that, because
I don't mind.
I think that there's a moral contradiction there because of what the IDF is, but and what the state of Israel is as a nation state. But we got time. When next time you come, we're gonna do that. You're gonna live another 100 years, so I got at least another 50. So we're gonna do this a whole bunch. I know Shabbat is very soon. In my brain it was 8:30, but in Israel I believe it's 7:30. Shabbat's coming. I apologize. I didn't realize it's already almost 7 now there at the time of this recording. So my brother, thank you. Thank you so much for your generosity, your contributions. You have welcomed me there when I've been there. You have shown me around. You've introduced me to different Afro descendant communities. You have been more generous than you needed to be, and I'm grateful to you and for you. And you've always been just a sterling representation of the community. And I can't wait to learn more and build more with you, my brother. So enjoy your evening, enjoy your weekend. Give my best to your family, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, brother. We appreciate it. Love and blessings to all of the viewing audience, and we're gonna keep the light on for you here.
That's what I'm talking about. Hallelujah.
Come on up.
Yes, sir. Hallelujah. I'll be there. All right. Everybody, you have been watching Office Hours right here on the Marc Lamont Hill official YouTube channel. I encourage you all to keep watching Office Hours. Every Sunday, we're going to be breaking this down with another brilliant mind, another brilliant, controversial voice. I know y'all got thoughts on all of this, so please keep your comments coming in. Also, hit the like button. Night School, Monday to Friday, 9 p.m. and Office Hours on Sunday, 9 p.m. This stuff happens because of your support. And that support means hitting the like button, letting the YouTube algorithms know that you are a supporter of this work and that corporate media can't dictate what you watch. Also hit the subscribe button so we can expand our footprint into the digital space and just make it easier for you to get the content that you want. And of course, if you're so inclined, hit the subscribe button. Hit the join button, excuse me. And when you hit the join button, you can become a monthly subscriber to the channel. That allows us to build technology to advance our agenda of independent radical grassroots media. It allows us to hire more staff, and it allows us to build that studio. And if you can't make the monthly commitment of joining, by the way, if you want to join, you don't see the join button, go to your desktop. It may not pop up on your phone. Go to your desktop. But if you don't want to do that, hit 1, 2, 3, or 4 on the screen. Go to Cash App, PayPal, Venmo, or Zelle, and just make a contribution to Night School or Office Hours. You also get access to the Classroom in the Cell podcast, coffee and books. You get all this stuff. We just ask you to support us. You can make a monthly contribution right there through Cash App, PayPal, Venmo, or Zelle. If everybody watching right now were to donate $10 for the month, we call it tuition, we'd be able to meet our fundraising goals. So please consider sending that $10 or more. And if you don't have it, that's okay. Just hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, spread the word, and share the content. That is how we grow. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Office Hours, and we will see you again soon. Peace.